So we are happy to have you here for our monthly utilization-focused evaluation webinar. Apologies to those of you who wanted to join us in July. We had to skip a month, but we're happy to be back, although we recognize August is a tricky month to get people to sit in front of a computer. So hopefully if you're watching this recording, you have been off somewhere fun. We are coming to you today from Minnesota. I'm joined by my father and co-author, Michael Quinn Patton, who probably needs no introduction. And we wanted to kick off this webinar, as we do all of our webinars, with a land acknowledgement. So I'm coming to you from about a mile west of the Mississippi River, and Michael is just a few steps from the Snake River, both in Minnesota. And we acknowledge this is Dakota land and Anishinaabe territory, and we are settlers on this land. Our ancestors came to what became known as the United States from Ireland, England, and Scotland, and they participated in and benefited from attempted genocide of Native people and enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans. And despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, we recognize this is and will always be Indigenous land, and we have a responsibility to interrupt the generational legacies of colonialism, racism, and genocide. And so we want to recognize what's happening on the land right now. We have a few pictures of pollinators. Our fields are in bloom and the pollinators are thriving, although not as much as they have in the past. And so recognize that we are part of this interconnected system, and that as humans are impacting the climate, we have a responsibility to address that as well. We also wanted to let you know that we've committed to redistributing the royalties from the utilization-focused evaluation book to a couple of Indigenous-led organizations on your screen, and welcome you to share other ideas for how we can continue to support that. So with that said, we're going to transition into our webinar today with a little bit of a reminder of the utilization-focused evaluation overarching principle, which, if you haven't joined us before, take a moment to just take that in. Focus on intended use by and with intended users in every aspect of and at every stage of an evaluation. So this 5th edition of utilization-focused evaluation has an overarching principle and 10 operating principles for how to engage in utilization-focused evaluation. And this overarching principle reminds us that everything comes back to use, intended use by intended users. And here are the 10 operating principles, and each month we've been going through one. And so we are now on the 5th operating principle. And so today we will be focusing on how to prioritize use. Just to give you a sense of how this fits together, really all of these, the 4 preceding principles were contextualize, personalize, customize, align, and now we're at prioritize, and they're all connected to that overarching principle of focusing on intended use by intended users. They all contribute to implementing that overarching principle. And so today we're going to talk about how to prioritize use. If you are interested, you can go back and watch the previous webinars to get a better sense of how those fit together. We'll be sending out a link to where those live, and hopefully some of you, I recognize many names, have seen them already. So again, here is our 5th principle. Make attention to use the driving force of evaluation from beginning to end. So this is how we prioritize use. And we begin with 3 basic premises. So the first is that expectations for use are set at the beginning. So you're talking about it right at the beginning of the evaluation. And that decisions, actions, and actions affecting use can occur at any time throughout the evaluation. So it's not just at the beginning, but that it's an ongoing process. And that it's the evaluator's job to support and facilitate follow-through action on findings and recommendations. So it's not over till it's over. It's an ongoing process. And so this really is building on one of our min specs. We have 5 utilization-focused evaluation min specs. And one of them is the full journey stance. And this really goes deeper into that and ways to really ensure that we're looking at use from beginning to end. Michael, do you want to add anything before we go on to how to do this?
No, I appreciate the introduction for people. I'm glad to be with you and see you all here. And what we'll talk about as we go along is the challenge of doing this. It sounds straightforward. It's utilization-focused evaluation. You focus on use, but there are lots of distractions along the way and other things to focus on. So people, evaluators tend to get focused on methods, on data collection, on the processes of gaining access to data, approval processes, analysis processes, and all of those are important. But what this principle reminds us of is that they're all done in service of use. So we'll be talking about some of the distractions along the way, which is why prioritize becomes important.
So the first step is really the preparation and readiness piece. And so really starting, as we said from the beginning, to talk about use and some of the ways that you can prepare intended users to use the data is to have a launch workshop or an initial gathering that both builds connections with and among the primary intended users. And the book, this is chapter 10 of the new book, and it has a table of, I think, 10 different exercises. Here are just a few of them, some of the ones that I really like to use, just to kind of give you a flavor of ways to really prepare and ready the users for use. One is just to start with an inventory and baseline of evaluation use. How are data currently collected? How have past evaluations been used? And this is particularly important for organizations that have already done some evaluation, to make sure that you are building on what's worked and not doing the same thing that hasn't worked over and over again, and really make sure that users understand that it's important to really look at what you've already done and learn from it, so you're not just throwing everything out the door.
Let me add
yeah.
on this one that when we're talking about use, we're also talking about process use. So when you hear use, you may automatically think about findings use, and that tends to orient people towards, well, we'll worry about use when findings come in. But this first exercise is a good example of process use, where you're getting people to think about how evaluation fits into their organization. What are they currently doing? Getting the mindset going around use. And this often has an impact by itself, that the very evaluation of how evaluations are currently being used or have been used in the past has an impact upon current systems of use, even before you begin a new evaluation. An example of this that we're finding we're doing more often is with developmental evaluation, that it's now often the case with an existing program or organization. The developmental evaluation begins with a retrospective developmental evaluation of how did the organization get from where it was to where it is now. Been working with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, 30 plus philanthropic foundations working on food system transformation. They're about to celebrate their 10th anniversary. And as part of that, there's a major retrospective developmental evaluation of how they have worked over the last 10 years that sets the baseline for the new strategic plan and the new evaluation of that strategic plan. So this is, while it's preparation and getting people ready, it also is substantive. And we find that it has an impact upon people to go through this process of reflecting on where they've been, what they're currently doing, to set the stage for the next activity.
Another exercise, the second one here, is to just gather baseline associations with the perception of evaluation. So sometimes I'll just put the word evaluate on the screen and ask people to just come up, share the first word that comes to their mind. And, sometimes those things are really positive. Sometimes people even put something like useful or interesting. And then sometimes people put really negative associations like burdensome or, requirement or things like that, and maybe even worse, that I won't share. And so really surfacing what, what positive or negative or neutral associations folks have as a way to really go forward, kind of understand where folks are at so that you can understand how to move forward and make the experience more positive and useful going forward. And then that kind of leads into the third one, which is to start creating a positive vision for evaluation. So what could that look like? What might that look like? And what really do people want to understand? And as a question in the chat, what is the response to the negative associations? Really validating that there are a lot of evaluations that have been done that have been harmful, that have, that it's not the way that we want it to go, but that is a reality, and that we are trying to right those wrongs and do it in a different way, and do it in a way that is going to be more valuable and useful. So that's kind of, not to get defensive and talk about how great evaluation is, but to recognize that there are definitely evaluations that aren't great or haven't been done in a way that's either culturally responsive or, that's much more top-down focused. Any other thoughts on that, Michael, or responses?
No, I do think it's important to recognize that people come to evaluation with baggage. The word is a big baggage word, and so we find it helpful to get some of that baggage out, not to assume that people are going to be enthusiastic or that they haven't had bad experiences. Sometimes they've had quite traumatic experiences, and so it's acknowledging that diversity of the way people come to this work, and in some cases that does lead to some more discussion, but it also leads nicely into the third exercise.
Mm-hmm. And then the last one here is just really sort of generally sharing a good idea in practice, a good idea that hasn't worked out in practice. And this can be done, as a team building exercise to get folks to get to know each other. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be related to the project or to work, but it kind of really just helps people understand that we are evaluating all the time, that this isn't something that has to be done only in one specific situation, that all the time we're having ideas and then we're gathering data maybe more informally that tells us that something maybe isn't working that we thought was. And it just kind of gets a chance to really root our lives in this idea of evaluative thinking and how we do it all the time. So I sometimes share the example of several years ago, we were going to rebuild the deck on the back of our house, and we had the idea to fly my husband's father out to help build the deck because he's a carpenter, and it would give us a chance to spend time with him and also get the deck done. And as it unfolded, we realized that there was never going to be enough time for him to actually finish it, and that it was probably a good idea gone bad. We ended up having to hire someone else to finish it, and it was not the kind of positive family building experience that we had hoped it would be. So even just things like that, as things unfold, you start to recognize that it's not working out the way you thought, and having to pivot is evaluative thinking.
I especially like to do this exercise with leadership because the messages that they convey about evaluation set a tone for the entire organization. And so when we do leadership training around evaluation, having leaders share their own examples of things that were good ideas that didn't work out in practice creates an environment where everybody realizes that there are things that don't work out that have to be adjusted, and it helps get people to overcome some of the fear of what happens if we have negative findings, that you can't really be a learning organization if there's nothing to learn. And so it's an opportunity to test out and affirm good ideas when they work, but to recognize when they don't. I just did this exercise a week ago with a group, and one of the first examples a participant offered was she had just come back from a 3-week cross-country vacation holiday with 3 children under the age of 6. And she couldn't imagine how in the world she thought it was a good idea to drive 500 miles a day with 3 kids under the age of 6 in a car. And she couldn't even go back to remember how they'd ever come up with it. But it was that led people to all kinds of interesting notions of things that they thought had been a good idea at the time that didn't turn out in practice. And that helps just set a learning environment that we often fall in love with ideas, things seem like they're reasonable at the time and don't work out in practice.
Are you sharing that idea because I'm about to go on a road trip with my 2 young children? That's a warning. Just kidding. They're not both under 6 at least. All right, this is over to you now.
So a part of what we try to do with utilization-focused evaluation is at the beginning is also to get past some of the compliance expectations that people have. And so this is one of my favorite examples that people expect an evaluation based on past experience and compliance activities to do certain things. So they often expect that what you're going to do is to come in and measure goals, or that you're going to do a logic model, that's just what gets done these days, that you're going to create some indicators. And one of the ways to turn the tables on that is to say, well, we may do that, but before we get into the compliance of what people have in their minds, we like to ask this question: what don't you know that if you did know would make a difference to what you do? And that moves it away from automatically measuring goal attainment or implementation or compliance or a logic model, but to really think about what difference evaluation could make. And it begins to move evaluation away from going through the motions. I find that one of the biggest barriers to use is compliance mentality. That evaluation is the pain that comes with money. It's the strings attached to grants. It's what you have to do these days. It's paperwork, it's reporting. And so there's not a mindset about actually learning. So part of our responsibility is to help create that mindset, and often do this exercise as a group. I describe an example of being invited to work with a school district where the senior people, the superintendent and associates, were fairly negative about evaluation. They associated it entirely with standardized testing. The district had problems with poverty and low standardized tests. And it was a fairly hostile environment. And so I said, let's forget all that. And let me just have each one of you, as a group of 18 people brought together for our initial evaluation workshop, have each of you write down 3 things that are answer to this question. What don't you know that if you did know would make a difference to what you do? Then put them in groups of 4 where they shared their answers with each other. And then we got back and reported them out. And at the end of an hour, we had, for the entire group, a priority list of 5 questions that they really were interested in getting the answers to. And it had moved from their thinking they were going to have to do my questions and do the evaluation that I imposed to their taking ownership of the questions. And that's part of the psychology we're looking for here, is that when we come in, people often think the evaluation is for us, that it's our thing, that we're there to sell evaluation, that they're going through the motions because it's required and we're the instrument of evaluation. But we're looking to change that psychology so that it becomes their process, something they want to find out, something they want to learn from, and that we become the facilitator of that. That is what this cartoon is about. At the recent European Evaluation Society meeting in Copenhagen, the first week of July, there was a presentation that included this policy from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that says evaluation is a high priority when program outcomes are difficult to observe and knowledge is lacking about how best to achieve results. Evaluation is a low priority when the results of our efforts are easily observable. And what that evokes is that on the monitoring side of M&E and the management side of M&E, those aspects of monitoring and management that are fairly straightforward around objectives and goals don't require special evaluation expertise. Being a low priority means it's a low priority for dedicated special evaluation funds, because the things that are more easily observable and measurable become part of management and monitoring. But that the more difficult, complex, complicated, challenging outcomes and issues is a place to focus on evaluation as a activity to illuminate, to take on wicked questions. And so it's an illustration of a part of the principles that run throughout utilization-focused evaluation is the situation analysis. What is it you don't know that if you did know would make a difference to what you do? What kind of evaluation are you trying to do, for what purpose? And the different kinds of evaluation and different priorities have different timelines, will lead to different methods, to different reporting frames. And so helping people think through the value of evaluation and the policies that inform it is a part of this prioritizing principle. And that means that one of the things that I find myself regularly saying to folks as we start an evaluation is that no evaluation can meet everybody's information needs. There are just many, many ways of doing an evaluation. There are many, many evaluation questions. And so we've used the image of the friendly jester whose job is to speak truth to, in medieval times, a monarch, and these days to policymakers and people involved in evaluation, that no evaluation can meet all information needs. So the notion of prioritizing is deciding both what information is a priority and information for whom is a priority. Intended use by intended users means establishing the priorities for both the intended users and the intended uses. Having that discussion openly, that's why we open with a workshop that has multiple stakeholders, different intended users. And part of that early work is laying out some of the options for evaluation. The next slide is the cover of a YouTube that I did, and I'll put the link to this in the chat. This is an inventory of different kinds of evaluations that has 101 different kinds of evaluations that one can do. I think I lost the link to it. Let me see what I've got.
I got it.
There it
It's
is.
in there.
Thank you. It's 101 different kinds of evaluation in about 15 minutes. And part of the purpose of that is to show evaluation as a panorama of lots of different possibilities. And so the facilitation challenge is, going back to the first principle of situation analysis, is figuring out what's going to fit in this particular case. And that has to do with where the status of the program is or the project, or whether it's a systems change or systems transformation effort, what the history is, how they're currently doing evaluation, that early exercise, when information is most needed. Evaluation has become a mini splendored panoramic thing with lots and lots of different approaches. And so the challenge is matching the particular evaluation approach. We treat utilization-focused evaluation as an umbrella, not as a particular model, but as an umbrella for making decisions about which kind of evaluation to do. So that if any kind of evaluation can be done under a utilization-focused evaluation framing, and it's a process for deciding what to do, what the timing is, what the priority questions are, who the evaluation is going to be before, and then to follow that through as the evaluation unfolds. And we keep coming up with new approaches. The field is expanding as new challenges emerge. And so keeping up with new directions. At the European Evaluation Society meeting, there were a number of new approaches, one of which is the footprint approach that Andy Rowe has been pioneering with Patricia Rogers and Jane Davidson here on the panel. They presented footprint, which is a closely aligned with Blue Marble evaluation and complexity-based evaluation. And you see that if you can read the slide, number 1 in the bottom left-hand corner is to map significant points of nexus between human and natural systems, possible consequences, and those potentially impacted, including consideration of humans and non-human species, and equity issues. They go through making this very place-based kind of work. The footprint is place-based. So number 2 is observing an actual ecosystem. Looking both upstream and downstream is number 3. Bringing to bear interdisciplinary knowledge from natural systems, local and indigenous knowledge. 5 is using systems thinking, feedback loops. And number 6 is focusing on the big issues, significant impacts, not just what is easily measured or achievable, but taking on the difficult questions as the Gates policy showed. And so footprint evaluation is a new approach that is completely in sync with Blue Marble evaluation and certainly with utilization-focused evaluation. So the field continues to grow and expand, and offering new options to stakeholders and intended users is a part of the way that we keep evaluation relevant.
So the other piece of preparation and readiness is the idea to fabricate potential findings. So this is when you actually facilitate a simulated analysis using data that you created, whether qualitative or quantitative, to actually practice using data before you get the real data back, to really help people understand what potential data they might have and how they might make decisions based on that. Do you want to give an example or more thoughts about how you do this?
Yeah, I think this is one of the least used and most powerful parts of utilization-focused evaluation. It is like doing fire drills. Actors do dress rehearsals before they do a full performance. Musicians practice together. They don't just come out and suddenly play their music. And so in any area where skill and knowledge is involved and practice is needed, we need to look for opportunities to try things out. So as Charmaine described, a way to practice using findings is to do a simulation. And it's helpful in a couple of ways. One is it practices the use. I've had the experience of working with a group for 3 or 4 months on getting the questions identified, choosing methods. This is done at the time when you pretty well have the evaluation design, you're ready to go into the field, and the final step before data collection is to fabricate some data and do a dress rehearsal where you've now got results, and you say, so if the results came in like this, what would you do with them? It's practicing use. And I've often had this experience where we run the simulation, and as I set up the exercise, somebody will look at me and say, wow, you're actually expecting us to use what comes out of this evaluation. And I'll say, well, we've been talking about that for 3 months, but they say, yeah, but wow, you're actually expecting us to use this. It's like it didn't quite get into their heads until they were faced with actual data. And it's important to have both positive and negative data. So you're dealing with how you're going to handle negative data, mixed results, and to be a bit playful with it. I've had the experience of fabricating some data and having the group talk about it and say, so what would you do with this? And they said, well, we'd take it to Bob. I say, Bob, who the hell is Bob? We've been working together for 3 weeks, 3 months. I haven't heard anything about Bob. Well, Bob doesn't like to come to evaluation design meetings. He doesn't like meetings, but he's the decision maker. And I say, Bob and I need to have a conversation here. If Bob's a major player in this, so that comes up. Another thing that comes up with fabricating findings, I suspect many of you have had the experience that we've had where you get to the end of a research or evaluation and realize there was questions you didn't think to ask. And when you go to interpret the data, you wish you'd asked some other question. Well, there's no perfect solution to that, but a simulation actually helps. And I often find that in doing the work around fabricating the data, in order to interpret, somebody will say, well, we probably also ought to ask these other questions. So an example, simple example, is working with a group on a conference. The American Evaluation Association conference is coming up in November, and conferences do evaluations. I was working with a group and about 15 planners for the conference, and they wanted to do a follow-up satisfaction evaluation. So I said, all right, what level of satisfaction do you need to achieve in order to say the conference was a success? And they talked about it, and they said, well, we think we would want 75% to be satisfied. So I said, all right, that's great. The results are just in your conference satisfaction data survey, and 73% are satisfied your conference was a failure. I said, well, we meant 75-ish. So then we talked about it. I said, well, we probably need to know who was satisfied and who wasn't, what they were satisfied with, not just knowing a number. And so we got into actually interpreting the data in a meaningful way out of that simulation. It's quite a powerful experience. You've got to provide time for it. You need to plan for it early on, have people expect to do it, be sure that they put in the time. But it's a great way to build momentum towards the actual findings as you begin to go into the field.
I admit to doing this not enough as well, so it's always useful to hear again, to reiterate it. So then we transition into this piece of ongoing attention to use during data collection. So now that we've got ideally folks on board, ready to use the information, it's really important not to then just go radio silent for a period of time and just start collecting data and not keeping intended users informed of what's happening. And so touching base and letting them know, were you able to get the data that you were expecting to get? What are the response rates coming in? Is the timeline changing? What's going well? What are the challenges? And, there are often ways to address those. So, the earlier you start to talk about them, rather than just put them in a report and then people are saying, well, we could have helped you with that. Really think about how to engage the users in and sometimes they're engaged in the data collection, but even if they're not, really making sure that they understand what's happening as you're going along. And then also, it's really helpful to provide some early feedback by reporting emergent and interim findings. Again, not just waiting for a final report, but thinking about how are you sharing what's coming out. And some of the ways that we've done this, we are working with a partner where we've done a series of group gatherings where a group of people, leaders from different congregations are getting together to talk about public safety. And they've had 3 different gatherings. And we've collected data from the leaders in between each gathering and shared that out, not only with the folks organizing the gatherings, but with the leaders themselves at the next gathering, to really show that we are using the data that they're giving us to adapt and to share back. And so really not, thinking about who you're sharing that interim data with. It doesn't only have to be a select group. It could include the broader participants if that's appropriate. But it's really helpful for people to understand that this isn't just going into a black hole, that it's being used, and it's being used both to make decisions and to understand what's happening. You want to add anything to that?
The related thing is to actually build in the design some findings that may come at different times. So this providing emergent and interim findings is also providing actual findings that are relevant early on. So to think about some of the implementation data that may be useful, instead of saving that until the end, to actually plan on some staged reporting of data, getting early reactions. And we had a launch on Monday of the new International Evaluation Academy, and where people involved with that. It's a new effort, and we started off with a word cloud of their sense of what the International Academy is going to be, expecting there to be a lot of uncertainty and confusion, but in fact, there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. And that was helpful for the planning committee and the executive committee to see. So you can stage evaluation findings so that it's not just all at the end.
Right. Another example of how we did that was when working with the Food System Summit. You've heard us talk about that if you've been on previous webinars or Blue Marble webinars, where we were analyzing hundreds of independent dialogues that came in advance of the World Food System Summit that happened last fall, hosted by the United Nations. And rather than just wait until the summit to present the findings, the team created, 3 interim reports, as well as participated in the pre-summit, so that the findings were integrated into the actual summit design, ideally. And so that was all built into that project, right, Michael?
And one of the things that emerged from doing the first interim report, which was a very small sample of only 20, was the deep dive, the need for going deep into some of the issues around gender and youth and small farmers and indigenous people. That came out of the interim, that wasn't planned, and added to the design as people provided feedback to that early report. I've got to get a drink.
If you need
Sorry.
to go get
Yeah.
some water. I'll keep going. All right. So during this process, there are some, challenges that can come up as you're doing this. So one is to really think about setting expectations. When you work with the primary intended users on the front end, really set up some expectations about how much information you'll share and the timelines in advance, so that they kind of know what to expect, but also making sure that there is room for adjusting that. So as Michael said, we set up initially those specific interim reports for the Food System Summit, but those deep dives emerged as another aspect that would be valuable. So balancing out really clear expectations with the ability to be nimble and flexible to address surprises that arise or potential timeline shifts. We all of a sudden learn about a meeting that's happening that's really important to have data for, that we didn't know about. Being able to pivot and get what we can for that is, rather than just say, well, I'm sorry, that's not when we're going to have it, trying to figure out what can we produce to be useful. That's really important. Another challenge is just maintaining confidentiality. So really making sure that as you're sharing interim findings and challenges, that you ensure that that interim data is really treated as interim as appropriate. So it may be that it shouldn't be shared externally. It may be that it's really needs to stay internal and just help inform what's happening rather than being shared publicly. And then there may be things that it's okay to share publicly, and that's a conversation with the intended users, as well as just making sure what you've told people who are participating, how their data will be used, that you stay true to that as well. So marking things as confidential or draft. Sometimes, putting things more in an informal memo than an interim report is important, particularly when you think about developmental evaluation. Sometimes, formal reports get treated as summative evaluations, where you actually want this to be more of a iterative, learning process. Sometimes a formal report is actually detrimental to that. So thinking about that and how you're using the data and being true to the confidentiality that is required. And then also addressing turnover. So depending on the length of the evaluation and who the users are, we've talked about this before, but you may have new intended users who you need to start getting up to speed as early as possible about what's happening and sharing whatever you can with them about what you've gathered, as well as get them on board with the design that you're using, and potentially, be prepared to adjust as needed depending on what they're going to need in their position. So not completely overhauling things every time someone new comes in, but being prepared to get them on board and make sure that what you're gathering is still going to be useful for them. You want to add anything, Michael?
I would build on the confidentiality and the turnover, and being very clear about different purposes of evaluation and how you feed that back to be true to that. One of the apocryphal stories is here in Minnesota. There was a high-tech magnet school in downtown St. Paul that was created called the Saturn School of Tomorrow. And the evaluation of that program was done by a university group that was the classic 2.5 years formative and 2.5 years summative. And in the first 2.5 years, the formative evaluation, people were promised confidentiality, dealing with real problems. This was just at the onset of the internet, of computers. Curriculum had to be developed. They didn't have enough materials to keep kids busy. Staff were having to learn. There were a lot of challenges. And the formative report pointed those out. But the formative report was a written report that was given to teachers and the staff, and got to the press. And the press didn't make a distinction between formative and summative evaluation. People had been promised in the school that they would have 5 years, and that the formative evaluation would only be used internally to help improve the program. But because it got out and was fairly negative, the school board got involved. The superintendent was fired. There were major consequences for the program. And a lesson I've taken from that example is not to write formative reports. Or if there is a report or memo or whatever, I actually, when I'm doing that kind of reporting to a group, number the reports, pass them out, collect them again, and make sure that they don't become public. If a feedback is meant for an internal group and is meant for them to learn and feel safe, you have to take extra safeguards to not have it become public. Some of the reports are the exact opposite. Their purpose is to be public. So the being clear about who is going to have what kind of findings for what use, that evaluation did a lot of damage to the credibility of evaluators of protecting and making a safe space for formative feedback.
All right, so that kind of gets us to making sense of findings. So as data comes in, really actively involving the primary intended users in analyzing the data, interpreting findings, making judgments, and generating recommendations. And just as we talked about in engaging users in methods decisions, this is not always accepted as a best practice. There are people who really do not think that users should be involved in this process. But what we've found is that it really increases their understanding of results, their sense of ownership, and their commitment to using the findings. And so in order to help support this, really, there's 4 steps, which is preparing for and facilitating the data analysis, then engaging the users in interpretation, facilitating and arriving at rendering judgments, and generating recommendations. So we'll walk through each of those. And that really kind of centers around 3 questions, which are what, so what, now what. Do you want to talk about this and how these all go together, Michael?
Well, you've laid it out very nicely. The analysis, the descriptive part is what did the data show? Then we move to interpretation and judgment, which is the so what question, and then the now what question. And involving the primary intended users in each of these questions gives them a deeper sense of what the data are showing. As Charmaine indicated, this is controversial. The 2 big controversies about utilization-focused evaluation are involving non-researchers in choosing methods and involving non-researchers in interpreting data. But this is also part of process use, because we're not just dealing with the findings of a particular evaluation. We're helping people learn to think evaluatively. We're helping build their confidence that they can make sense of data, and that the recommendations are really their recommendations about taking action rather than the evaluator's recommendations that they then have to react to. And so in many of the organizations we work with, they have adopted as their mantra for evaluation the questions what, so what, now what. Glenda Yang, who's with the here in Minnesota with Human Systems Center, has made her work around complexity based upon these questions and has had great success in helping people simplify their work by asking what, so what, now what kinds of questions. And we've adopted that as a part of an evaluation framework.
Yeah, I find when I say it, it feels very simple, but I get a lot of ahas of just like, oh, okay, so we don't have to be as complicated as we think. It's really can be that simple. So as you're preparing for analysis, just making sure to organize data based on those evaluation questions. Keep it simple and balanced. Don't overload the users with all of the information, but really make sure that there's enough there to help them make the analysis, and be clear about what you're talking about, how you define the different indicators and pieces of data. Make comparisons carefully and appropriately, and organize data by pattern. So we have an example in the book, and Michael, do you want to walk through these 3 data sets with them?
Yeah, this is a survey that the state of Minnesota did on the needs of physically disabled people. 10 items: transportation, housing, education, medical care, employment, public understanding, architectural changes, direct financial aid, changes in insurance, and social opportunities. And the survey asked how much for these things they felt: great need, much need, some need, or little need. In the initial feedback, the state evaluator presented the raw data exactly this way. This is how the items were asked on the survey, and this is how they were reported out. There are 40 numbers there on the page, and you can't make any sense out of it. So one way to try to make sense out of it is simplify and combine great or much need with some or little need. Now the results are clear and easy to interpret, but not useful because it doesn't differentiate. And the whole purpose of this exercise was to set priorities. So the third analysis is simply the percentage of who reported great need for this. And now the data are very easy to understand. And the discussion is where to draw the line, how far down, how they want to allocate money, but everybody can understand the results and make sense of them. And then they have to be interpreted and judged for how they're going to assign dollar values and programmatic activities to these results. So it's a nice example, I think, of our responsibility to facilitate the data interpretation in ways that are understandable to people.
And, we are not the data viz experts. You can go to Stephanie Evergreen and many others for other ways to do this, but in a very simple way, like this doesn't take much to really think about how to make the data useful, at least in this early analysis phase. Or interpretation phase, and then we move into analysis, as Michael said. Then, as you begin to see trends, engage users in exploring what the data show. Simply ask them and distinguish facts from interpretation. So trying not to jump ahead. Users will always want to jump ahead to talk about like what they're going to do next. And so really trying to focus on that piece of just what the data are showing is really important for us as evaluators to help slow them down and really getting them into that piece. And then you can move into the interpretation piece, which is really, both quantitative and qualitative data has to be interpreted to have meaning. You can't, you need to look at what the data are showing and really thinking about, that data are imperfect indicators or representations of what the world is like. So it's important to remind the users of these things and then really help them look for some of these things. So intraocular significance means something that just hits you between the eyes. It's obvious. You can see that is important. And so that's the first thing to look for, like what jumps out at you right away. That is going to be the most kind of significant thing to start with. And then really think about, there are going to be things that aren't as clear, that ambiguity piece. Maybe, as Michael said in the other data, there are some numbers there in the middle. It may not be clear what to do with that. Consider different alternatives to that. But really staying within the confines of the nature of evidence, like not jumping to conclusions based on what you've gathered, but really thinking about what these data are telling you about that so what piece. What does this mean? What do you want to add to that, Michael?
I think that's good.
Okay. So the final piece is rendering judgment. So this is the value piece of evaluation. And so one of the pieces that's really critical during this stage is to separate attribution from contribution. And that really involves different types of questions. So thinking about, the difference between has the program caused the outcome to what extent and in what ways has the program made a difference? How much of the outcome is caused by the program versus how much of a difference has the program made? And most often in these kinds of situations, we're looking more at contribution than attribution, unless you've really done a randomized controlled trial and that's appropriate for the situation. More likely, you're going to be looking at contribution questions. And the caveats when you're rendering judgment is really making sure that you understand that the quality of the judgment depends on the quality of the findings and the thinking that you're bringing to it, and that there are going to be differing opinions. And so it's important, we say, to keep an open mind and don't condemn the judgment of someone else. And also just practice making judgments. It gets easier as you begin to make judgments based on data to really help understand how the judgments you're making, what they're based on. Anything else you want to say about making judgments?
All I would add is in the simulation exercise we talked about earlier, that's a time to also practice the questions, what, so what, now what, and making these distinctions between the descriptive facts, the interpretations, the judgments, and then the recommendations.
And that brings us to the recommendations. So what should be done? What are the action implications? And ground that in data. So anything that comes up as a recommendation, link it back to the data that you have gathered. And this will also kind of come up again when we get to principle 9, which is follow through of how to then write final reports and support the implementation of these recommendations. And this is a cartoon from Chris. Is it Lacey? Is that how you say his last name? Lacey, one of our favorites. Anything you want to add there, Michael?
Nope.
All right. So putting it all together, taking the findings from data analysis to interpretation, to judgment, to recommendation options, but also recognizing that there may be some loop backs and it's not always going to be linear, but that this is part of this journey, full journey stance, prioritizing use from beginning to end is really putting it all together and involving intended users across the process. I'll let you explain this final cartoon.
Well, maybe we just let people read it. It's
Read
a Sufi tale, and we've got 5 minutes if anybody wants to put a question in chat or come off mute and make a question or comment, and we'll let you read through this cartoon as we interact a little bit here for 5 minutes. Any questions or comments in chat or coming off mute? You're all good? Well, the last caption of the cartoon is really the theme of this principle: be present for the whole journey. So from the beginning and through to the end, it's staying focused on use and asking questions. There are lots of little decision points along the way, lots of forks in the road, lots of things that come up. And utilization-focused evaluation simply means asking how any one of those may affect intended use by intended users.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. We will stay on for a few more minutes if you want to come off mute or ask a question or put anything in the chat, but we also, you're welcome to sign off if you feel like you've gotten what you need.
Jim is saying sometimes it seems we have a compulsion with recommendations. How might we work with a group to balance? I lost it there. It jumped on me.
Balance
How might we work
organizational.
with learning with getting to recommendations? It's a great point, and one of the things that I find is helpful is to move people from direct recommendations that say do this to doing scenario recommendations that are if then kinds of recommendations, so that if the economy goes into a deep recession, what are you going to do? If the effects of if there's a climate disaster in your area, what are you going to do in relation to the data? If there's suddenly a new program or a loss of funding or an increase of funding, so that you get people into contingency thinking rather than do a single thing. And that the instead of calling them recommendations, often it's easier to that frame of what, so what, now what? Now what is, what do we do with the findings? That may be different than a concrete recommendation. The recommendations, the very language is kind of stifling, that it's a formal thing that you have to put out there and do something with. But asking the softer question, now what? Here are the data, here are the interpretations. Now what do you think about what's next? That helps soften it and get people into the learning mode a bit more, we find. Thanks for the feedback, Paul. There are a couple of new YouTube videos. One that is about my experience at the European Evaluation Society, about lessons from swans that I had fun doing. And then there's also one that just came out last week. I came back from a conference on the poly crisis, the overlapping crises that got me thinking about and talking with Charmaine about skin in the game and soul in the game and our stance in relationship to the challenges of our time. So I invite you to have a look at those, and Stan, we'll look forward to hearing your story one of these times. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Yes, we love you. You know that, don't you?
Take care, Stan.
Bye.
Bye.